On to introducing tonight's speaker. So if nothing else after tonight, you're going to go home having seen a Merlin. So that's pretty cool. I've had a really interesting day with Merlin. I picked him up last night from the airport and we pulled out of Ronald's Way onto that roundabout turn right, and straight away a bird came down in front of the car and flew along in front of the car for about 10 metres, and it was a barn owl. So we thought that was a pretty good omen, I think. So if you don't know, Merlin Hanbury-Tenison is a Cornish conservationist and veteran who founded the 1000-Year Trust, Britain's rainforest charity. The charity's mission is to catalyse the movement to triple Britain's rainforest cover to 1 million acres in the next 30 years. Sound familiar? His work has been featured in National Geographic, The Guardian and on the BBC. Merlin lives in a rainforest in Cornwall with his wife Lizzie, an entrepreneur and business advisor, and their 2 young daughters, who sound amazing. I've heard quite a bit about them in the last day or so. His book, Our Oaken Bones, if you haven't read it already, I can highly recommend it. I actually first heard about Merlin from my sister-in-law, Kate's sister Jen, who went to an event at Farm Ed, which is a sort of educational farm, if you don't know, in the Cotswolds. And she said, you've got to read this guy's book. It's brilliant. You'll love it. And so I did, and I thought, yes, he's very interesting. I think we should get him over for a talk. So here we are. So Our Oaken Bones tells Merlin's own story, from the pain of devastating miscarriages and suffering from PTSD after military adventures in Afghanistan, to Merlin and his wife Lizzie deciding to leave the bustle of London and return to his childhood home, a Cornish hill farm called Cabilla in the heart of Bodmin Moor. There, they're met by unexpected challenges, a farm slipping ever further into debt, the discovery that the overgrazed and damaged woods running throughout the valley are in fact one of the UK's last remaining fragments of Atlantic temperate rainforest, and the sudden and near catastrophic stricken by COVID of Merlin's father, the explorer Robin Hanbury-Tenison. As they fall more in love with the rainforest that Merlin had adventured in as a child, so begins a fight to save not only themselves and their farm, but also one of the world's most endangered habitats. Oaken Bones is an honest and intimate true story about renewal, the astonishing healing power of nature, and our duty to heal it in return. And Isabella Tree, who I'm sure you all know, described the book as an extraordinarily courageous, urgent and powerful book. So if that alone isn't a reason enough to read it, I don't know what is. And as I say, you can buy copies today that he will sign for you. So anyway, you've heard enough from me. I will shut up and I will hand over. Please put your hands together for Merlin Hanbury-Tenison.
Can everybody hear me? I'm a bit quieter than you, but can people hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Good evening. Fast am I. Thank you so much for welcoming me over to the island. I'd never been to the Isle of Man before, and I've had such a wonderful welcome and such a wonderful 24 hours since I've been here that I feel truly almost like a stopover, rather than even just with my short time here. So I'm very grateful, and thank you so much to everyone who's here this evening. I'm very aware that you're giving up your evening to come and hear me talk, so I really hope that it's not a letdown, and thank you for giving up your time. And thank you so much to Manx Wildlife Trust. I feel really, really well hosted. I do a lot of work with Cornwall Wildlife Trust, who are a wonderful organisation close to my heart, and it's lovely to come and work with a different wildlife trust and see how amazing they are. And Graham and Kate have both looked after me extremely well today. I've been wallaby hunting in the Corrock, which has been, and we saw about half a dozen of them, which was amazing. I slightly thought it was a joke, and then suddenly a wallaby just hopped away from us in front of the track. It was amazing. And then I've been to Milne Town, which was really lovely to have a look around there and have lunch there before going to Hairpin Turn Woods and then finishing up at Glen Alden, which is just the most stunning landscape and not one that I expected to find here in the Isle of Man. So it's absolutely beautiful, followed up by supper in the Creek Inn. So I feel like I've had a full Isle of Man experience. So thank you so much for welcoming me here. As Graham mentioned, I'm going to talk about my book, Our Oaken Bones, which is in equal parts a story of reviving a family, a farm, but also our ancient rainforest on the British Isles, which is something which I know is a big theme for many people working in nature conservation here on the Isle of Man, and I'm sure many of you in general. And so I look forward to talking to you about that this evening. I'll aim to talk for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then I hope to have as much time for questions for anyone who wants to ask anything about it. So why isn't that working? No? Okay, well, thank you very much. I will go to, I think it's there we go. It's now gonna suddenly jump across 6 slides because I've pressed it 6 times. There we go. So as Graham mentioned, I grew up on an upland hill farm on Bodmin Moor, and this is my home farm Kabila that my father farmed from 1960 up until he handed it over to me in about 2016, and it's a very similar landscape to what I've been walking through today. So it's something that everybody here would recognise, these oak-dominant, wonderful Atlantic temperate rainforest landscapes. And having grown up in this forest, where the farm is about 2/3 farmland and 1/3 ancient oak woodland, and I spent my childhood playing in the river and in the oak glades and making dens and making up stories about the fairy folk and the piskies. I left home when I was 19 and I joined the British Army, and I was very lucky to join the army at a time that was very busy for our military, and it was just after 9/11, and I ended up going away to Afghanistan on 3 separate tours, combat tours with my regiment. And in the first of these, I was blown up in a Taliban-laid roadside bomb, which destroyed my vehicle, and very fortunately my crew was all survived, and I survived as well. And I remember at the time, just before that actually, we'd gone through some very basic, very low-level mental health training. For anyone who's done mental health first aid, a very similar program to that. And as a very young and probably quite arrogant 21-year-old young army officer, being told that if something happens to you in Afghanistan and it might be traumatic, then you might not feel the symptoms or you might not start to suffer from PTSD for up to 10 years after the event. And I remember thinking at the time, don't be so ridiculous. If something happens to me and I'm going to struggle with it afterwards, I'll know instantly. And if I don't know instantly, then it'll be within a week or a month at the most. And it was almost 10 years to the day after coming back from that first tour, or from being blown up in that first tour of Afghanistan, when I was working up in London, that I had a mental health breakdown and was diagnosed with complex PTSD related to those incidents, but also to something that I'm sure many people here will be familiar with, just the stresses and the pressures of modern working life that many of us are expected to bear, which is why the mental health pandemic in the West is quite such a prevalent issue at the moment. And I was incredibly lucky to be able to come home to this forest and be able to retreat into it. I went through the traditional NHS healing process, the clinical process, but I was also able to spend a lot of time deep in nature and really benefit from this habitat. And at about the same time that this was happening, my wife Lizzie and I were trying to start a family, and we're going through problems which are far too common and I think far too little discussed, that she was having a number of quite traumatic late-stage miscarriages, and she was retreating down into this valley to lie in the river and heal both physically and psychologically in the forest that we had at Kabila. And then a year or two after this, after we'd fully moved down to Kabila in early 2020, my father, who at the time was an 83-year-old who lived with us, caught COVID-19 and fell very badly with it. And he was rushed off to Plymouth Hospital, where a doctor phoned us up and said, look, your father's 83 years old, he's got this new disease, we're going to sedate him, and we think there's probably about a 20% chance of him surviving, because at his age the chances aren't very good, but we're only going to sedate him for a week, so he should have a good chance of pulling through. And he ended up being sedated and put into an induced coma for 7 weeks, and his lungs filled with fluid, his kidneys failed, he had secondary infections across his body, and the doctors phoned us and they said, look, you need to make your peace with the fact that it's very unlikely, he's not coming home, you're not able to come and see him to say goodbye because we were all locked down, but you need to make your peace with the fact that he's going to die. And they took him off the sedation medication so that he could slip away, and he started to wake up. And they phoned us and said, this is actually quite miraculous, we didn't expect him to wake up, but he's seeming to wake up, but you need to be very cognizant of what that means. And what that means is that he'll be in hospital for at least the next 6 months while he goes through occupational therapy and physiotherapy. He'll probably have severe cognitive impairment after 7 weeks of sedation at his age. His brain function's likely to never be the same again. He's likely to have very severe physical impairment, probably be in a wheelchair or bedbound for the rest of his life and need round-the-clock care. And they then telephoned us 3 days later and said, would you please come and collect him? He's really irritating. So we went and collected him from Derriford Hospital and brought him home, and we plonked him down in this forest as well. And he set this, exactly, it was the best place for him. And so we plonked him down in the valley for a couple of months for his healing in this wonderful habitat. And he set himself a pledge that he said that 5 months after coming home from COVID, he would climb Cornwall's highest point, which is similar in some ways to Snow Fell here. It's not a huge mountain, but it's our highest point. We're very proud of it, which is Brown Willie. And he said he would climb Brown Willie unaided and raise money to build a healing garden in Treliske, Cornwall's only hospital, because he put a lot of his survival down to the fact that there's a healing garden at Derriford where they could wheel him out even when he was plugged into all the machines in ICU, and he was able to benefit from sunlight and nature being around him. And 5 months after coming home, he climbed Brown Willie and he raised £150,000 to build a healing garden in Treliske. So he's and a few months ago he turned 89, and to celebrate it, he rode up and down our border with England, the Tamar in Cornwall. So the bugger just won't die. But I'm very proud of him. And so we had these three wonderful individual healing stories, and it really started to focus our attention from a very personal level into what it was that we had in the valley and what made it special. I'd grown up in this forest and I knew it was very special, but I'm not a scientist and I didn't really know any of the data or the details about it. So we initially started to look at things like the Doomsday Records from 1086 and work with the Ancient Tree Forum, an amazing collection of Marvel Avengers of the tree world. And they came and they looked through the forest and they were able to identify that this forest has been in place since 1086. It's 1,000 years old. We knew it was at least 1,000 years old, which is very rare in the United Kingdom. We've cut down 98% of our ancient woodland. I know the statistics are broadly quite similar here on the Isle of Man. And we also call ancient woodland anything which has been around since before the year 1600. So we're saying to these forests, which predominantly are oak, that if you're over 400 years old, you're ancient, which to humans feels very ancient. When you think that an oak tree can live for 1,000 years, it's like telling people who are 20 years old that they're old age pensioners. You know, these 400-year-old forests are toddlers in the oak's eyes. So we already knew that this was a 1,000-year-old forest, which already made it quite special from a kind of a woodland and habitat perspective. And then I started to work with the Eden Project, who are a wonderful group of scientists and enthusiasts. And they sent a team of soil scientists to us who did a paleobotanical peat core survey across the whole valley, where they basically get a giant corkscrew and they screw it down into the ground, and when they bring it up they can look at the pollen record in every millimetre of soil, and they can look at what the land use has been like for a very long period of time. And I got to know the head scientist, Mark, very well, and I used to pester him to say, look, I need to know the dates, Mark. Is it 1,000 years old? Is it 1,100 years old? Is it 1,200 years old? How old is this forest? And he would tell me to shut up and get back in my box, because he was a scientist and he needed to crunch the data and he wanted to be specific. And after about 4 months went by, I took him for a pint and I pushed him on the dates again, and he pushed back again, and we slightly had a bit of a heated conversation. And eventually he said, look, I'll tell you all I know, but I'm not comfortable telling you this because I wanted to be more specific. But all we can tell you is that this forest is at least 3,664 years old, give or take 29 years. That will do. And he said it was probably much older, but that's as deep as our core went. So we knew we had 4,000 years of uninterrupted growth, which makes this one of the oldest patches of woodland left in Cornwall, if not in the southwest, and made it remarkably special. And it was at about this time that people started to use this term British rainforests, which was something, and I used to always ask people for a show of hands as to who in the audience knew that we had rainforests on the British Isles. And 3-4 years ago, everyone would put their hand up and say, no, don't be so silly. And people would tell me I was frankly mad, and I'd confused it with the Amazon. And now it's wonderful to see this reclaiming of this term as we begin to remember that we are all a rainforest people who live on a rainforest island, whether that island is the United Kingdom or whether it's here on the Isle of Man. These are rainforest landscapes. And it's been wonderful to start to talk about what it is that makes a rainforest. And a lot of this comes, even if you weren't necessarily familiar with the term temperate rainforest or Atlantic temperate rainforest or British rainforest, I guarantee that all of you will be familiar with them from the stories from our childhood, because these are and all of these pictures are taken at Cabilla. This is at home. These are the wet oak woodlands of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthurian legends, where knights would meet to do battle. I hear even that we might be standing near Avalon, where King Arthur's ancient resting place is. So these are the forests of the Arthurian legends, of Tolkien's Fangorn forest, where Ents would roam from glade to glade, of the Jabberwocky, or maybe even the Buggane, who would whiffle through them, and of stories like the Mabinogion. These are our oldest habitats and our oldest places, but they do have some strict delineation. So in order to be a temperate rainforest, you have to receive a large amount of rainfall. So you need to have at least 1,400 millimetres a year. And that can't all fall in one big monsoon season in November and December, more's the pity. And I'm sure as you experience here, as we experience in Cornwall on our peninsula jutting out into the Atlantic, we get our fair share of gifts from above. So you need to have that rainfall falling every month of the year. And the real reason for that is that it supports the very powerful epiphytic growth. These wonderful lichens, mosses, polypody ferns, liverworts, pennyworts. And really the thing that defines these rainforests is that layering, that life upon life upon life, all of the things that live upon all of the things that live upon the things that live upon the things that live within these habitats. So we have this wonderful epiphytic growth. And that's often also supported by really strong fungal growth as well. And I'm sure many people here will be familiar with the term mycorrhizal networks or mycelial fungus. And whilst there isn't technically a necessity for temperate rainforests to have a strong mycelial bedrock in the soil, it's almost inevitable that they go hand in hand, which creates this wonderful wood wide web of interconnectivity between the trees, which means that when you're in a temperate rainforest, you're not walking over a big patch of mud with 10,000 trees growing out of the ground. You're generally walking over a giant mushroom with 10,000 fingers all pointing up in the air, all in constant communication and constantly synchronized with all of these other species within it. And it creates these very cacophonous and riotous and busy habitats where you get a lot of life living together. And as we've done more and more scientific research into Atlantic temperate rainforests and what makes them so special, we've begun to realize that it's not only from that wonderful heart-led folkloric perspective of spaces that we love to spend time in, but there are also some really clear ecosystem services that they provide from a scientific perspective. So at a time of climate crisis, where we're all seeing in the papers how temperatures are rising and the climate is really struggling, very little sequesters carbon more effectively, in fact almost nothing terrestrially, that we can plant and re-establish more than our Atlantic temperate rainforest. Because we have that busy layering of life, not only are the trees sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, but so are the epiphytes and so are the things living upon them and living upon them. So you have this multiplying effect of things sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, and then that mycelial network in the soil beneath is a wonderful carbon store. It locks that carbon down beneath the ground. So they become these fantastic ways for the UK or the British Isles to do their part in taking carbon back out of the atmosphere and locking it into the ground. We're also in the British Isles, or the UK, I know, is the second most nature depleted country in Europe, much to our shame for a formerly rainforested island. The winning country is Malta. But we're the second worst nature depleted country in Europe. And nothing restores that biodiversity abundance, that layering and that trophic system in its entirety more quickly and more effectively than our Atlantic temperate rainforest. They are our biodiversity arcs. Everything from beavers, you can see our beavers there, that's Sigourney and one of her children, Beavy Wonder. And so everything from beavers down to the entomological level and also all of the plant species, it just brings back life in such a crowded and packed in way. But for me, the thing that really resonates the most, and I hope will align with many of you this evening, is that it's also being shown increasingly that these are one of the most effective habitats we have for the mental health and well-being of the humans who spend time amongst them. So as these forests photosynthesize, they suck carbon out of the air and they pump out oxygen, but they lace that oxygen with volatile organic compounds called terpenes and phytoncides that when we humans breathe them in have a remarkable impact on our physiology. So just spending 30 minutes in a temperate rainforest and your cortisol level, your main stress hormone, drops to a level that can still be measured up to 2 weeks later. It boosts kidney function, it improves our immune system response, it helps to put us from our sympathetic nervous state, our fight or flight, that we evolved to spend minuscule amounts of time in when we were being chased by a lion or a tiger. And now we spend great swathes of our time in the modern world in our sympathetic nervous state. And our temperate rainforests help to move us into our parasympathetic nervous state, our rest and digest, our state of homeostasis. So I believe that not only in a time of climate crisis and biodiversity and ecosystem loss, but also at a time of mental health pandemic in the West, they're a wonderful weapon in our fight against all of these three challenges, and that makes them very important. Now, I must apologize for this slide, because I only noticed this evening that it only does a cross. It only does the mainland, I'm afraid, of the United Kingdom. I mean, Ireland are equally as angry, because Ireland is a wonderful temperate rainforest climatic envelope, and the Isle of Man absolutely should not be left out from this slide. You can basically assume it would all have been dark blue and purple. But so it's thought that about 3,000 years ago, up to 20% of the UK would have been a rainforest landscape. Everywhere from Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis, down past places like Mallaig, Fort William and Oban, down through Cumbria and the Lake District, across places like here on the Isle of Man, but also down that western belt of Wales from Anglesey to Aberystwyth down to Pembrokeshire. And then in the southwest, where I'm from, down across Exmoor, Dartmoor, Bodmin Moor, the Lizard and West Penwith. These would have been our rainforest belt that would have created this Celtic belt that ran across the west of the United Kingdom and was a wonderful climate break. If you imagine when hot, dry weather comes in off the Atlantic, this would have chucked up moisture that would have dampened that for the east of the country where we grow most of our food. And when storms come in off the west, it absorbs them into it. So it was a wonderful way on a localized level of us combating climate change and climate trauma that we're facing. And from this state of 3,000 years ago, it being about 20% of the British Isles, we've now moved to a state where this is the current laydown, which is about 1% of that, maybe a little under. So we've cut down about 98 to 99% of that amazing habitat, and in exactly the same way that we all hear about as we're growing up and either going to school or just in the news now, about how in the Amazon rainforest, farmers are being encouraged to go out into pristine rainforest to slash and burn back that habitat and make very poor grazing land for cattle, which is a completely non-native species to South America, for it to go into our McDonald's burgers. In the same way, we have been slash and burning and cutting back our temperate rainforests across the British Isles just for a lot longer than they've been doing in South America, to the point where even though 50% of the world's tropical rainforests still remain, we've cut down half of them, but half remain. We've cut down 99% of our Atlantic temperate rainforest, to the level that most of us don't even remember usually that this is a rainforest land. And there are three real reasons why this rainforest disappeared. The first, of course, was humans. We were the ones that initially cut it down. But since then, there are two main species that are preventing its revival. In much of the United Kingdom, one of the big problems we have is deer. So there are 6 different deer species in the UK. 4 of them are exotics, they're non-natives. But our 2 native species, red and roe deer, are way outside of their carrying capacity. So we have far more than we should have with the absence of apex predators. And these just move through our rainforest, eating all of the saplings and making sure there's no new growth in succession. I know this isn't a problem that you face on the Isle of Man, although I did meet several of your 2-footed rare Manx deer today in the Corrock. But then the other issue is sheep. And sheep are a real challenge when it comes to temperate rainforest upland habitats, because they are very voracious feeders and will eat a lot of the rainforest species that try and grow through, especially young oak saplings. But also sheep have very small hooves that will compact the soil as well, and that really, when sheep are put in large densities on hillsides, that can really prevent temperate rainforests being able to return to these habitats. And then manure also, it does strange things to the ground. Now, when Lizzie and I moved back to Kabila fully in about 2018, we were looking at the farmed landscape, and this is a photograph on the edge of the Kabila rainforest, and we were for a long time a sheep farm. And I was looking at how to make a living on this land and how to raise a family there one day, and how to be able to pay bills and just keep a roof over our head. And sheep farming was one of the most natural things to come to, because it's what had often been done on this land. And when I began to look a bit deeper around the prevalence of sheep farming in the UK, you can see that we really do have a fondness for sheep farming across the UK. And you can see that across all of Europe, it's really just us and the Sardinians who like to have sheep on our land. And one of the things that I've been chatting a lot with Graham about today is the delicacy and fragility of island habitats, something that I know on the Isle of Man many of you will be very familiar with. Being a relatively small island, you have to be very careful what species are brought in and what species you lose from these habitats, because they're very fragile ecosystems. And the whole of the UK is a series of islands. Sardinia also is an island, and we've put a lot of sheep onto these landscapes. Now, if sheep belong here, if they evolved here, like our cattle did, the original cattle variety being the aurochs, like our horses, the original horse variety being the tarpan, like our pigs, which would have evolved from wild boar and been domesticated and bred until they were more docile and carried more meat. If sheep fit into that system, then it makes complete sense that we farm them in such a large amount in our western uplands. But if you were to compare this model, which is the density of sheep in Europe, to sheep's evolutionary range, it creates quite an interesting picture. This is where sheep, Ovis ares, the original sheep variety, came from. It's a Mesopotamian, Persian, Turkish, maybe a little bit of Balkan species, which was brought 4,000 years ago along the Silk Road routes because they were easy to transport, and their wool was very good for making clothing, and their meat was easy to move with them, and then they were bred and bred and bred until we get all kinds of very interesting local breeds, like the ones I've seen with huge numbers of horns on while walking around these islands. But these animals, even though for us, again, as humans, 4,000 years feels like a huge amount of time, and surely we should accept them as native after that amount of time. To Mother Nature and to evolution, 4,000 years really is just a drop in the ocean. And if it needs any further demonstration of correlation and causation, these are sheep densities across the mainland of the UK, and here is our old temperate rainforest zone. And up here in Scotland, it's where red deer have become extremely prevalent because of the stalking industry, and they now have 20 deer per square kilometre across the Highlands of Scotland. And Nature Scot have shown that in order to have temperate rainforest restoration in Scotland, you need to have a density of 2 deer per square kilometre. So they're at 10 times the density that Scotland can take. And then for Wales and England and Cornwall, it's sheep, which are our real issue. But that would be fine, and this is what I was looking at when we were starting to establish ourselves at Kabila. This wouldn't matter if sheep farming was a wonderfully profitable business and we were all eating lamb and mutton 2 meals a day and all dressed in British wool, because surely then this would be an important part of both our clothing security, our food security, and also the finance of our rural communities and our rural economy. But as I started to look at this a bit deeper, so the top, no, it's all on here. So when I was starting to do this research and figure out how we could live at Kabila, it was in 2018, which was when we'd voted to leave the European Union as a nation in the UK, but we hadn't left yet. So we were starting to figure out what a post-Brexit agricultural subsidy system might look like. And this is what farming subsidies looked like in 2018. So the South West took £450 million worth of subsidies every year from Brussels, from the European Union. It was about 5 billion in total that Brussels would send over to the UK. And it was really understood that this Common Agricultural Policy payment had become a social payment rather than a farming payment. It wasn't being paid to produce food security, it was being paid to keep people farming in traditional ways that they always had up until then. And to then look at that even closer, when you look at how these farming subsidies broke down, and don't worry, there won't be a test at the end, and this is the last graph I will show you. This is how each of the different farming types in the UK work. So the dark blue is the amount of money that a farmer actually makes from the type of farming they're doing. The light blue is the subsidies that were at the time provided by Brussels to top that up to make sure that farmer was able to stay on the land. And if you're a poultry farmer, and this might be why the River Wye has become completely polluted with chicken farms, then it's a very profitable way of living. The same with horticulture and some other areas. But if you're an upland livestock grazer, then this is all debt. None of this is profit, and it's all subsidy. And I found an NFU report in 2018 which showed that the average upland hill farmer on Bodmin Moor and Dartmoor, where I live, on Bodmin Moor, took between 85 and 92% of their annual income from European subsidies. 85 to 92%, 9/10 of what farmers were earning was a handout from Brussels, which we knew was going to end in the next couple of years. And it's created a lot of trauma, a lot of challenge. I don't show any of this to in any way disparage sheep farmers, because they're the hardest working people I know, and they're doing what their government and society has encouraged them to do for generations now. But it's become incredibly difficult for them, and there's a reason that the average age of farmers is 62 and it has the second highest suicide rate of any job. And it's because of how difficult this lifestyle has become. But it's clearly a moment of change and a moment of opportunity, potentially for ecosystem services and for our rainforests and for our connection to this natural world. So what we decided to do at Kabila, with these 3 wonderful healing stories that we had of mine, my wife's and my father's, was we wanted to bring more people into this space. So we stepped back initially from traditional farming and we built our retreat centre, Kabila. And the idea was this was a place where we could bring veterans suffering from PTSD, NHS workers suffering from stress, people working up in cities who suffered burnout, and anybody who really needed to come into nature and bring them into these are some barns just on the edge of the rainforest where they would be able to go through facilitated retreat programs, 3-day programs of breath work, sound therapy, movement practices with yoga, Pilates, somatic therapy, and cold water immersion, things like that, all within a safe setting, and also not ever asking anyone to get uncomfortable. But then also being able to get down into that rainforest very quickly. And this is a wonderful way to be able to get people into the rainforest. And in the last 5 years, we've now run 168 retreats at Kabila. We've had 4,000 people come and stay. And I think we always have this sort of binary approach to nature conservation, nature access in the UK, where we say, well, either an area is for people, in which case we sacrifice the natural world, or it's for nature, in which case we fence it off and keep people out. And I really rail against this, and I didn't want to see this happen at Kabila. I think that we are as much a part of nature as any other species, whether it's an oak tree, a lichen, or a beaver. We are also we are a rainforest creature ourselves. And it was about trying to make sure we brought as many people into the space as possible while seeing the space thrive and improve and heal as well. And we've been paying very close attention to that. And of the 4,000 people who've come to stay, I judge everything we do at Kabila based on the tear rate, which is the positive emotional outpouring I'm able to get people to go through while they're staying. And we run at about a 65% tear rate of people who break down in tears while they're staying. And I won't be happy till we get that up to at least 80% across the board. That's what I'd like to see. But so Kabila Cornwall, our business, was how we were able to facilitate bringing more humans into the rainforest and connecting more people with this landscape. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure we were really doing the work that needed to be done for the habitat. And so alongside the business, in 2023, we founded our charity, the 1,000 Year Trust, which is currently the only charity in the UK that is solely dedicated to Atlantic temperate rainforests. We work very closely with amazing organisations like the Woodland Trust, the Wildlife Trust, and the National Trust, all of whom are doing great work around rainforests. But I wanted to make sure there was one charity that was all we did. And so we could keep the spotlight shining on rainforests long after others might have moved on from their jobs or moved on to other habitats when the need changed. And this started on Kabila. So here you can see Bodmin Moor, which is the upland area in eastern Cornwall, and that red line shows Kabila, my farm, which is this area here on the right-hand side. And as you can see, it's about 1/3 Atlantic temperate rainforest, ancient woodland, which is about 85 acres. And then 2/3, about 165 acres, are what was traditional sheep grazing land. And what we've done is, rather than doing what every farmer has been encouraged to do for probably the last 2,000 years, which is if you take over a farm which has farmland and some woodland, the prevailing advice is cut down that woodland. That is rubbish. You can't make that into IKEA. It's not good firewood because it's not straight softwood. And so that is an inconvenience. And for economies of scale and efficiencies, you want to cut down as many trees as you can so you can put more sheep and more cattle on the land so you can have a higher density of animals, you can get more meat, more wool, more milk, and that's your business model. But that business model has not only been failing farmers, it's also been failing the landscapes and failing the health of the natural world. And so I wanted to see if we could flip this model on its head and instead of trying to reduce our woodland and increase our grazing land, see if we could do it the other way around. So we've now planted up the whole 165 acres of grazing land to return into a temperate rainforest landscape, a mosaic. And this is a 50-year view of what that's going to look like over the next couple of decades. And the really important thing about this, so we planted 40,000 trees already. There's another 60,000 to return due to natural regeneration because the Forestry Commission have been very keen that a bit of both is at play. But the really key thing is this system of glades and rides. I call it the python eating 50 hamsters because it sort of looks a bit like that. And the idea with this is, as any ecologist will tell you, the really exciting parts of the natural world aren't single habitats. It's not closed canopy forest or grassland or meadowland or peatland. It's the transition points. It's the edge habitats. It's the bits where you go from one habitat to another. That's where all the predation, the pollination, the interactions, all of the different exciting things in nature happen. And by putting in this system of glades and rides, what we've done is we've taken this farm, which has a 7-kilometre perimeter, and we've given it 28 kilometres of edge habitat, which just slingshots and increases the abundance of life and the opportunity that life has to thrive. Everything that we've seen returning, like small pearl border fritillary butterflies and different bird species that had been lost for decades, and they're coming back because of all of this edge habitat that's being restored, which I think is really exciting. And it also gives us the ability over time to bring back a native breed grazing program with cattle, things like belted Galloways and longhorns, pigs, so we have some large blacks which simulate the activities of wild boar, and also horse varieties, because forests like this are healthier when animals are within them. We have this very strange concept in the UK. We think that farmland or grazing land is lots of fields with no trees and big animals, and woodland is lots of trees with no big animals. And actually all of our native animals, our cattle, our horses and our pigs, evolved within forests and are happier within them. They get shade in the summer, they get shelter in the winter, and they get additional forage. And all of our forests are happier when big animals are in them as well, because they help with coppicing. They help churn up the ground with dominance displays and wallows, which is great for mycelial health and amphibian life. And they help to create those pockets of light that are so necessary to allow invertebrates to thrive as well. So creating a mosaic is, I think, the most important part. This ancient rainforest that we have is closed canopy, and it's lovely, but it shouldn't all be closed canopy. That's too much. So it's really nice to see this start to return. And what it looks like at the moment is, of course, 40,000 tree tubes with young trees growing out of them, which is just the start point. But we've already got the trees in the ground, and already since this picture was taken, which was about a year ago, all of these have a foot of tree coming out the top of them. We were told by everybody, it's amazing how many people tell you things with great authority who know nothing about what they're talking about. Everybody told me you can't grow trees up here. It's too high, it's too exposed, they won't be able to survive, they'll all die. We've had a 96% success rate of the 40,000 trees we planted. They're thriving, and we had similar feedback around our beavers. You can't put beavers in here, they'll eat all the fish, they'll dam the rivers, they'll cut down your trees, and they've just been a wonderful accelerant to the natural world. But the thing I want to end on and speak about just before sort of stopping whittering away is I've become really obsessed with the idea or the mission over the last few years that I would imagine everyone in this room is familiar with tropical rainforests. We all grow up hearing about the Amazon, Borneo, the Congo Basin, and how important these habitats are. And until very recently, I would imagine many people in this room had never heard of the rainforests of the British Isles, and that this was a habitat that was new to us. And a lot of this is because tropical rainforests are so well studied and researched. There are probably 10,000 scientists right now in the world's tropical rainforests, from Belize and Costa Rica through Brazil to Borneo and southern Malaysia, doing amazing work to help learn about how important that habitat is, the lungs of the planet, and how we can protect it. There are almost no scientists doing similar work in the world's Atlantic temperate or the remaining Atlantic temperate rainforest that we have at the moment, and that's one of the reasons very few of us had heard of them until recently. Now, if you're a young conservation scientist who's just finishing your studies and you want to have a career in rainforest research and restoration, it's almost inevitable that you're going to do that in one of the world's tropical rainforests. And that makes sense because there's a lot more of them. But there's also hundreds of universities with dedicated courses to tropical rainforest research, dozens of research institutes providing millions of pounds of funding every year for tropical rainforest research. And I think most importantly, dozens of field stations where you can travel out to Belize or Costa Rica or Brazil or Borneo and immediately go and join multi-year, multidisciplinary research programs and be mentored by experienced professors and contribute to peer-reviewed papers and shift government policy and societal opinion about tropical rainforests. If you want to do the same career in Atlantic temperate rainforests, there isn't a single university with a course dedicated to that subject anywhere. There isn't a single research institute providing funding in a dedicated way to Atlantic temperate rainforest research. And there isn't a single field station where you can go and actually get into a temperate rainforest and learn what makes them tick and get them on the agenda of politicians and school curriculums so that children across the world are learning that there are more than one type of rainforest. There's more than just tropical rainforest, there's also temperate. And so that's why at Kabila we are currently building, with our beaver, Europe's first Atlantic temperate rainforest research field station, a place where scientists, professors, academics, journalists, even politicians maybe, will be allowed to come and stay in the edge of one of the oldest and most intact temperate rainforests, certainly in the southwest of the UK. I always like to say that the Atlantic temperate rainforest bioclimatic envelope runs from Bergen in southwest Norway to Braga in northern Portugal, and if you draw a line between the two, you hit Bodmin in the middle. So lots of bees, and we are the natural nexus, the linchpin, the midpoint of temperate rainforest research. And we're building this incredible research station. We're breaking ground in December, and it will be built by this time next year. If anyone knows any friendly millionaires or billionaires, the 1,000 Year Trust is taking donations towards this cause. We're building it with this amazing, and it was wonderful actually to see some of Manx Wildlife Trust's lichen re-establishment programs that are happening up in the Glen this afternoon. But this will have a living roof which is dedicated to lichen re-establishment. One of the hardest and thorniest issues around temperate rainforest restoration is how you get those lichens, those wonderful kind of string of sausage and old man's beard lichens, back into these young forests, because they can take hundreds of years to colonize and move across. And this research station is going to be a cutting-edge, world-first place where we will establish how we can do that and then help to catalyze rainforest re-establishment. So we don't just plant trees and wait 1,000 years for rainforests to come back. We can plant trees and then be a part of bringing them back more quickly, because we certainly cut them down pretty quickly, which will be a wonderful mission. And really, the focus of this is taking these landscapes, which many of us have grown up, I certainly grown up with thinking that this is the most natural way for these upland landscapes to look. And this actually looks remarkably like the hills I've been looking at today while driving around the north of the island here, and turn at least some of them back into this, which is what they once were. And I think there's space for both on our islands, which would be a wonderful thing to do. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to me.
Merlin, thank you very much. Probably the most interesting bit for you is the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely.
You did say you were happy to do some Q&A.
Of course.
So we are recording this, so if I can ask, if you do have questions, can you wait for the microphone? I've got one here, obviously, and there's also one up at the back as well, just so we can hear the question. Oh, there will be one up at the back as soon as Hannah gets there. Fast down. So mean. Yeah, so...
Oh my God, you're all here!
Did you not know they were here?
No, you sort of speak with a light in your face, and it's wonderful because you can just imagine there's no one there. There's actually lots of you.
So questions, hands.
Firstly, thank you, and really excited to hear the work that you're doing. When you talked about the sheep and the farming and how you can then convert that back, you mentioned how difficult it was because of what was in the soil. So I'm not a scientist, so is there kind of a simple explanation for people that might want to do this to know how possible it is?
To restore soil after sheep farming? I mean, I think we're always looking for binary solutions to really complex problems. And in the process of writing the book and now speaking about it more, I've been to visit hundreds of farms and spoken to hundreds of farmers, and no two farms are anything like each other or comparable. Some are total green deserts of sheep-pocked prairie land where you just think this is going to take a lot of work. Some are actually wonderful nature habitats where there are small tweaks. Some are doing far better than we're doing at Kabila, in all honesty. So there's a huge range, and I think that Kabila has very steep-sided slopes, like many of these upland areas. And when you put sheep on these steep-sided slopes, because they are desert creatures by their evolution, they have these small hooves that compact the soil and they make it like a concrete, which means that when it rains in upland areas, the runoff just comes straight down into the valley. The rivers get fat and they're filled with spate, and then you get floods downstream. And in Cornwall, we had Boscastle as a good example about 20 years ago, where a whole village was washed into the sea. And it's really because of that impact. It's because we've taken beavers out of the landscape, which are wonderful for holding floods upriver, and then we've filled these upland areas with sheep, which compact the soil, eat all the vegetation, so there's nothing to hold the water back, and then their manure can be quite toxic. But at the same time, there are certain species of dung beetle which thrive with sheep manure, so it's never a simple answer. And I think, I'm in no way advocating that people shouldn't farm sheep. I think the economics are making sheep farming already incredibly difficult, and I think farmers should be helped to farm in a way that not only supplies us with a strong food security model, but also provides all the ecosystem services we provide. It's the hardest job in the world being a farmer, because you have to feed people, you also have to provide timber, you also have to provide clean air, clean water, clean soil, flood prevention and drought prevention. And we're only paying farmers for one or two of those things. The others we expect them to do for free. And so if we want our farmers to transition away to a model that might help the soil to restore and the landscapes to restore, then we have to lobby our politicians to subsidise and encourage farmers in the right way. Because we will always have subsidy-backed farming in the UK. It'll never be a system like New Zealand where they don't have subsidies. And therefore we are all a part of encouraging politicians to encourage farmers to farm in the way that society wants them to. And farmers have always been very adaptable and agile at doing that. When society says to them, we'd rather you farmed in a certain way, the subsidies trickle down and farmers change their ways. So I don't know if that's really answered your question, but I think that's the best way is to lobby for it. And I think a few sheep in some instances are, we need small herbivores working in different ways, but we just really need to start viewing, in places like New Zealand and Australia and other island nations, they're so good at looking at the landscape and going, that is native, it evolved here, that is non-native, it's been brought in. And because we've had things that have been brought in for quite a long time, we've lost that objectivity, and I think we need to get it back.
Thank you, Merlin. I appreciate you've got one neighbour that wasn't a big fan of the idea of beavers, but have you seen other landowners next to you starting to look at this as a model they'd like to try and follow? And could you see Glen Alden doing something similar here? And if so, sort of, what is it that we need to try and do to encourage that?
I really hope so. And I think, so when we started talking to people, doing stakeholder engagement in probably 2018, all of our neighbours thought we were mad. And the Cornish, as I'm sure there's similar here, good Celtic nation culture, they love to see you fail. And they love to see you try something new and go, well, we told you it wouldn't work. And so everyone kind of sat back and went, well, we'll let them have a go and see what happens. And then we got to about 2021 when Brexit had happened and the subsidy changes were beginning to bite, and DEFRA was starting to say, oh, these basic payment subsidies are all going to reduce. And quite a few of our neighbours started to come to us and go, well, actually, we're interested to learn more. And then we got to a couple of years ago where the subsidy reductions are really starting to bite, and more of our farmers are saying, actually, we can see it's working, we'd really like to be a part of it. We now have a farm cluster with 16 of our neighbouring farmers covering 7,000 acres of Bodmin Moor, who are all aiming to do, to some extent, the same thing that we're doing at Kabila. So we're now turning that from what is really a blueprint, a case study site, because 250 acres is a drop in the ocean, but we're now turning it into a landscape scale restoration programme, which actually is large enough to hold certain migrating species and larger sustainable species of animals, which is the next really exciting step. So I think the answer is to do it by example. And if it's seen to work and seen to not ruin landscapes and not completely bankrupt the people doing it, then those who surround it will come on board. And beavers, I think, are such a wonderful example of this. When we, it's a great example of reverse shifting baseline syndrome. That when we started our beaver project again in 2018, everyone thought we were mad. They thought it would eat all the fish, they'd dam all the rivers, they'd kill all the trees. And now, and all the news stories in 2018, whenever beavers were released somewhere, were, oh my God, maniacs with chainsaws, these are eco-terrorists, they're going to destroy our landscape, they've been gone for 400 years, they're basically a non-native species now, this is awful, what's happening? And now, whenever you see a news story about the return of the beaver, it's generally a very positive story. The last one I saw was in Shrewsbury town centre, where they're all so excited and they're putting up hides to watch them and they're protecting them. And it's a good example of how in just 7 years, basically most of society, and certainly the mainstream media, can go from saying, this is terrible to this is quite good news. And it's the same with rainforest restoration. It'll be the same with other species being brought in as well. That things that at the moment we are nervous of, I think we will come around to.
There was a lady right there, Hannah.
Hello there. I just wondered what you thought about the elephant in the room, or rather the wallaby in the room. What do you think of the fact that we're allowing the wallaby to colonise on the island, and an animal that is also apparently riddled with disease? And how many wallabies do we actually have on the island now? Does anybody know?
Between 950 and 1150, I think the survey found.
Yes.
I feel like I might be walking into a bit of a bear.
Well, yes.
It's not my island.
Maybe I should be asking this question.
I feel like you may have an opinion about this subject.
Sorry, maybe it's a question of Manx Wildlife Trust, I'm sorry.
I have good record for putting my foot firmly in my mouth when it comes to issues, like my opinion about the way we own domestic cats in the UK, which is one of, people say, someone asked me the other day, they said, what is the first thing you do to fix nature in the UK if you had the ability to wave a magic wand, which of course people ask me a lot with my name. And I said, well, I'd ban golf and I'd ban cats. That would fix nature, because the amount of some words that are being ravaged by cats, and we have more land in the UK under golf course than we do orchard. That is terrible. And golf courses are deserts. There's nothing good happening there. And so those are the first two things I do. Those would both make me incredibly unpopular. Probably more unpopular than removing wallabies from the Isle of Man. But I think I believe that our role as keystone species, as humans, I think that we've all become familiar with the concept that we're a part of nature, not apart from nature. We've been told it so much, I imagine everyone's been told it as much as I've heard it, that it's become this kind of truism, this trope. And that's a good thing, because it is true. We are a part of nature, not apart from nature. But I think that the next step in that understanding and acceptance of the fact that we sit within nature, not as some creature built in the image of a monotheistic God, which puts us separate to nature, means that we have a responsibility to participate in the natural world. We are an ecosystem engineer and a keystone species, and we should be doing the job that we were put here to do. And I think that comes down to three very simple actions. The first is, if a species is native and it is absent, then it should probably be here, especially if it is absent as a result of human activity. So when I think in the UK, that is things like the beaver, things like even apex predators like the lynx, pine martens, wildcats, glowworms, pool frogs, many of the species, eagle owls, Dalmatian pelicans, many of the species we've removed, we should bring them back, because they perform a function and that function is missing. If a species is non-native and we've brought it in, and when I think of that, I think of 4 of our 6 deer species in the UK, of rhododendrons, of Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed, grey squirrels, rabbits, wallabies, maybe, then we should probably be removing those species, because they will be damaging these fragile habitats in ways we don't understand. And then the third action we can do, which actually is the hardest, is when a species is way out of its natural carrying capacity, either too high or too low. And when you look across the uplands here, you see the way bracken is growing, and the way gorse is growing, and the way in some areas holly or bramble grows. And that wouldn't be happening normally if you had the presence of the large herbivores and grazers and browsers that would have normally roamed across these hillsides. Then we need to be the proxy to try and bring these things back to a state of dynamism, tension, and equilibrium. And those are the 3 things I think we should be doing. There are no comments on wallabies.
I can cross the one back there. Yeah, just on the other side, Hannah.
Who was it? I don't know how we get there. Oh, so I have to pass it along.
Hi, brilliant talk. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming to the island. I suppose one question I'd have is, you see this incredible biodiversity and incredible species density within tropical rainforests. And whilst our remaining rainforests over here do have much higher density than comparable land, there's a lot that's been lost, especially due to how much habitat has been reduced, how many animals have been removed, that sort of thing. So how do you combat that? Are you looking toward reintroduction of rare species? And are there any sort of non-native species that you would sort of maybe bring back to fill that role, particularly in a plant-based sense?
A great number of questions. So the first one being the amount that we've lost and how we bring it back. And there are a number of reasons why I called the charity the 1,000-Year Trust, and it enables hope and optimism when it feels really dangerous or difficult, because you think, actually, I want people to step out of this ridiculous short-termism that we've fallen into as humans, where we judge everything based on 5-year timelines, because that's what our politicians and our business leaders have told us we have to do. So you'll read articles saying, can we fix climate change by 2030? No, we can't. But could we fix it by 3020? Well, we could. And none of us will be here to see that, and that's obviously a great sadness, but it's also a lot more selfless if we try and put in place measures that we will never get to benefit from, but our children's 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 children might. And that I think is the work we should be doing. So when it's a 1,000-year project, then we've got time and we can make it work. And when it's oak trees, actually they need that time to really not just grow one generation, but have several turns of the wheel of generations, bringing that diversity back to the soil as well as into the canopy. Our remaining fragments, not just of rainforest, but of many of our rare and fragile habitats in the UK, are all in a state of island isolation. And when these small islands end up, even the Kabila rainforest, which is 85 acres and feels like a good size, that's still a tiny patch of woodland comparatively. And that as a result is shrinking. And the Kabila rainforest has no trees in it less than about 150 years old, because our apex predators are gone, which means our deer don't live in a landscape of fear, which means they just hoover up every sapling as quickly as they can. And we brought in species that don't belong here, like grey squirrels, and they eat everything as well. So these islands are shrinking, and the first thing we can do is start to expand them, like ink blots, going in the correct direction, not retracting but expanding. And if we just put a 100-metre buffer around every bit of temperate rainforest remaining in the UK, that 1% remaining, that would double the amount that we have. Just a 100-metre buffer. That's almost nothing. And then if we kept on doing that and went up the river valleys, these areas like the Glen I was up today, where actually that is not really effective farmland, because it's really steep-sided hills with a river in the bottom, and it's really hard to farm that, and you're going to get really marginal gains out of it. And if you just look at these river valleys as the connective tissue, like the capillary network within the living landscape, and use that for our rainforest connectivity, then suddenly you've brought back that tripling of the rainforest that our charity is hoping to be a part of. So I don't think it's actually that far outside of what's realistic to bring back these habitats. When it comes to species reintroductions, the final part of your question, I think that's something that we should engage in with great care and great caution. I don't believe we should bring non-native species into island environments. A lot of people are proponents for that, for bringing in things like Mediterranean climate resilient species of holm oak or other downy oak to come in because they're going to be better when the climate increases along IPCC predictions. But I think actually if we all put our shoulders to the wheel now and plant native species in our temperate rainforests and actually give them a few decades to grow up, then that will create the localized climate buffer that means we don't need non-native species to come in. Because guess what? Every time we humans have thought we're clever enough to bring a non-native species into an island environment, and we've gone, oh, cane toads, they won't do anything weird. And then a couple of years go by and we go, oh, we're not as clever as we thought we were. Actually, there's a knock-on effect or a secondary or a tertiary or a fourth level effect that we weren't able to factor in, which has been damaging to that island. So I think we should trust this beautiful evolutionary system which has created complexity far beyond anything we'll understand, and bring that back in as much of its diversity as possible.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm kind of speaking a little bit out of turn for my mother-in-law. She's at the beginning of a journey with trying to do something like this, but on a much smaller scale. Is there anything you would recommend? I know obviously you're working with 85 acres, did you say, or more? But what would you recommend for somebody who wants to do something a lot more small scale?
I think I'm so aware of the huge fortune I have to have this 250-acre farm that I've been able to do this with, and I know that for many people that's not the reality that they live within. But I think even if you have a window box or a small garden or a single field, there are so many things you can do. And I always come back to these I always try and work in threes just because it's easy for me to remember. Make it wet, make it messy, make it native. Is if it's any nature that you find that is dry, especially in temperate regions, is probably unhealthy. So there should always be water, preferably open water if you can, so that birds and insect species have somewhere that they can feed. It should be as messy as possible. We love tidy nature. We all basically have OCD. We've ruined our woodlands by picking up all of our deadwood, which has meant that there's nothing for the sap-prolific species that love to feed off all this deadwood. We should be leaving mess wherever we can find it, not mowing our lawns, and leaving little divots of mud, and especially on slopes, making sure it's as uneven as possible so that water catches and pools and soaks into the soil, and then having that focus on planting things that evolved within these systems and therefore are supporting to other species within it as well. So wet, native and messy, I would say. And also, shameless plug, but for anybody who wants to spend more time in nature, I do think our wildlife trusts provide such an amazing facility. They all have volunteer. I work, as I mentioned at the start, with Cornwall Wildlife Trust very closely. They have volunteer programs. So when we're trying to get people from inner cities especially, or from towns who don't have that connection to nature, into the natural world, Wildlife Trust will have volunteer programs which won't only walk you through a bit of wildlife, a bit of woodland or a bit of grassland, they'll get you working in it, which is the best way to get your hands dirty, to actually not only benefit nature but benefit yourself. And the more we ask Wildlife Trust if we can volunteer with them, the more volunteer programs they'll have. it's a wonderful self-licking lollipop that will just keep on getting bigger. So we should all be asking Wildlife Trust to put on more volunteer opportunities so that we can all get out and access really wonderful nature.
Thank you, Merlin. I was going to say exactly that. And are you on island? Yeah, so you may not have space at home, but there probably will be things that you can do. But if you just want to make a difference, you can come out with us tree planting, you can join Hannah, our community ranger, on local community-led projects that can really make a difference. So you're not powerless, you can definitely get involved, and you can do that through us to get in touch. There was 2 others down here.
Yeah, the loss of lowland wetlands is going to impact on the upland temperate rainforest, isn't it? And we are seeing a lot of over and inappropriate development in the British Isles. So how, you've got a battle on because you're planting new trees, but all the time development is encroaching, isn't it? So how do you feel about that?
I just feel very lucky that I'm not a politician, because I get to say I don't know, and I get to be very one-track minded around the habitat that I'm sort of pinning my colours to and being able to spend my life working with, which is temperate rainforest. And I do believe that we have at the moment, so the government have begun a national land use strategy, which is the most important thing, because we have to be able to step back and we have to be more flexible about what we consider to be cultural identity. We have this real problem, especially on the uplands, of communities saying, well, we're going to keep on farming in this way because it's what we've always done. And it's not what we've always done. It's usually what we've done since the Second World War, sometimes since the First World War, if we're really being really bold in looking backwards. But actually, historically, those landscapes were managed in very, very different ways. And I think we have to be comfortable with that flexibility and that evolution. But we have to look at these landscapes in a very objective way. We need spaces for people to live. We don't have enough affordable housing across the UK. We are also the second highest importer of timber products globally after China. That's shocking. We import 82% of our timber in the UK from overseas. And we need to plant more quick-growing Sitka spruce softwood to be able to have a sustainable timber industry in the UK. That's really important as we build more homes and look to source more internally. We need to grow our own food. We currently do a pretty good job about that. People often ask, how will we be able to support ourselves if we restore more nature? We grow 58% of our food in the UK internally. That's better than most countries in Europe. And most of that, 42% that we import, is avocados or strawberries in December, or the fact that we want to be able to go to a pub or a restaurant or a supermarket and eat whatever we want to eat any day of the week. It's not food security, it's choice security. And so, yeah, we're pretty good from a food security perspective, but we could be better, a lot better. We also have to have clean air, clean water, clean soil, and beautiful places for all of us to spend time. That's bloody hard for politicians or the lawmakers to sit there and go, and we shouldn't be going, actually, Scotland's for people to spend a nice time, Wales is to grow food. That needs to be layered in every area, all of those services being done in every area of the UK. And I'm very glad I don't have to make those decisions, but that's what we need to do.
Hi, what a great talk. Do you foresee at any stage of the evolution of what's going on an introduction of maybe bison or wild boar, as I've witnessed in the northeast of Poland in the primary forest there? Right.
That's why when my wife gets so angry with me when she says things like, if we won the lottery, where would you go on holiday? And I say, northern Poland. She's like, no, I want to go somewhere warm. I'm like, no, I want to go see bison in the wild, migratory herds. Again, I can't speak for the Isle of Man, because I know that here you have very specific native species, and there isn't a fossil record for many of the species which in the UK we do have a clear reason to bring back, and I have no idea whether there were any bison here. But I've been over and seen the bison programs in Kent and the water buffalo programs that they have in Kent. And I think that beavers, again, provide such a wonderful case study for what can be done by a small group of determined people in the face of everyone telling them they're wrong. And the beaver community, the beaver believers, all of us, Beavers Without Borders, they're back now. And we're going to see beavers on every river across the UK within the next 5 years. And broadly, people are accepting that that's really good for the natural world. And I don't know what species will be the next big campaign, but it could be bison or water buffalo. We're seeing already with wild boar in the Forest of Dean, and people are going, they're terrible, they make nature messy. And you go, well, they're actually just doing what they're meant to do, and it's in some ways it's really helping. So I think we need to learn to live more with slightly wilder animals. And when it comes to species reintroductions, it needs to, depending on what species it is, it needs to be a slow process, but I'm excited for everyone that's approached.
Do we have any genetic scientists who can bring back giant deer?
The Wapiti.
You talked about finances and subsidies earlier, and I'll ask you a wave your magic wand question. What would subsidies or finances, what would you want to see that works for farmers and for the rest of nature as well?
I mean, that's a really good question, and we had it. You know, we had the ELMS program and the sustainable farming incentives, and actually, love him or hate him, but the last thing that Michael Gove did, really, well, not the last thing, but the last thing he did was stab Boris in the back. But one of the good things that Michael Gove did when he wasn't doing some of the bad things he did was he created the plan for the greener future plan, which I'd encourage anyone to look up if you're interested in this subject. It's all online. It was the 25-year environment plan that he wrote when he was the Minister for DEFRA, and it has all of that in there. It's got a transition from Brexit. So the Brexit subsidies were all, the Common Agricultural Policy subsidies from the European Union were all an evolution of the Dig for Victory subsidy policies at the end of the Second World War. And then we then went into the European single market. It then became the Common Agricultural Policy. It ended up with lakes of milk and mountains of butter and all of this because farmers have been told for now 2 generations, you have one job, and that job is to grow food. Just grow as much as you can. It doesn't matter what happens, just grow food. And it ends up with it being very strange incentives and very strange supply chains. And what Michael Gove created with his A Greener Future plan was a transition off that, almost like methadone, off an addiction that we have to these subsidies, into one that focuses more on public money for public goods and an ecosystem and environmental services whilst having a strong food security network as well. Unfortunately, recently, all of those subsidies have been watered down and many of them have been removed, which is, I think, a great sadness. But we're also living at a time where the NHS and social care and education are crumbling, and the government has to make hard choices, and it's made hard choices around agricultural subsidies. So if I had that magic wand, I would put that system back in place, and I think it would be a good thing.
We're going to have to let Merlin go eventually, so let's say last 2 questions if we've got them. So, okay, I'm going to take that one there, and this gentleman here, sorry.
I don't know it, it's you guys.
Yes, I've enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to know more about the disease of the trees and what do you do with the diseased trees in the woodlands. Do you take them out or leave them?
You mean like ash dieback?
Yes.
Phytophthora and
yeah, all those
any
ones.
ones that are left, poor things. So I think the first thing we must do is plant really mixed, complex woodland systems. So planting single species woodland should not be something that we do, and also planting woodland where it all comes from one source, or even worse, comes from overseas, we should not do. Biosecurity is so important, and if we haven't learned this with ash dieback, we should have learned it with Dutch elm disease and 100 other diseases that have come here from overseas. You know, we really need to be careful around the biosecurity and the provenance of the trees that we're planting. So the first thing is having a planting plan which has a really mixed system, and that planting system that you saw for Kabila, so our ancient woodland is about 80% oak and then 20% standard rudderals, so things like hazel, willow, rowan and a bit of holly. In our planted area we're going down to 60% oak, and it's a mixture of sessile and pedunculate, so Celtic oak and English oak. And then you've got all of these other hazel, rowan, willow, crabapple, birch, common alder, Scots pine. So you have this really mixed approach so that if a disease comes in which targets one species, you don't lose your whole forest, you just lose a few trees. The other thing that I think we need to be far more comfortable with, and I mentioned this earlier, is one of the things I'm terrible for is I should just be saying to everyone, just buy this book. But I'm going to give you a reading list of other books that I think are great. So these are some of my gateway drugs into nature restoration. And Peter Willoughby, his Hidden Life of Trees, which for anyone who hasn't read it, please read it immediately. It's very small, very easy to read, and it will make you fall in love with trees in a way that you never thought you would. And he shows that a healthy forest, 40% of the wood weight in that forest should be lying dead on the ground, rotting down for 100 years. You know, we shouldn't be going into woodland and tidying things up and pulling out all the dead wood and turning it into firewood or just basically making everything tidy. We need to leave dead wood rotting down, both standing dead wood, which is so important for many bird and bat and insect species, but also lying, rotting deadwood that the fungal species and beetles can all eat down as well. So I hope that answers the question.
I think it's quite fitting that the last question goes to one of our woodland rangers.
Thank you. Just wondered what you think the kind of major barriers are to more farmers doing what you're doing. Particularly, I guess, it sounds like the woodland you already have on site is quite a big advantage with the ecotourism and things. So maybe a farm which doesn't have existing woodland or only has a limited amount, how kind of financially feasible is it for them to do this as well?
So you're absolutely right. There's challenges around it, and ecotourism I never view as part of the financial model because, firstly, ecotourism isn't very profitable, but secondly, it's kind of got this converse correlation in that the more ecotourism there is, the less custom people get because there's only so many ecotourism opportunities you can have in an area. As I showed earlier on those graphs, there is nothing profitable about farming sheep on the uplands, and I would challenge it. I mean, some farmers who do it at massive scale are able to make a profit from it, especially from the old traditional subsidies, but it is at the moment a really challenging lifestyle, and the rural economy and the rural community is really suffering from that, certainly in the upland areas that I work in the UK. When my father started farming at Kabilla on the same size farm, they employed 8 people full-time, because these small upland hill farms did, and that was 8 people who sent their children to the village school, drank at the local pub, shopped in the local shop, and that was the beating heart of the rural community. When I took the farm over nearly 60 years later, we employed 1 seasonal worker for half the year, and that's what efficiency and economies of scale have done. They've torn out the employment base that a lot of these upland areas used to have. So we now are in a position where the average upland hill farmer takes 85 to 92% of their annual income from European subsidies. Those subsidies are reducing. More and more farmers are putting their farms on the market or going out of business. This transition, this change, is not about saying, let's do something which is going to make you more money than all the money you're making from sheep farming. It's saying you're currently probably, and I haven't spoken to any farmers who've told me to go away because they're already making so much money and they don't need to talk about it. They're probably already struggling. This is a way to create a more financially resilient business model, and that is layered between carbon credits and the carbon credit schemes, which are, that market is growing, biodiversity net gain, ecosystem services subsidies, and direct consumer meat. I think there's a real world in which the way that we can bring grass-fed, rainforest raised cattle, pigs and horses through these temperate rainforests will mean that we get a much higher premium for that meat. As even though the yield is reduced, the labour is also reduced, and the profit that you get per animal is much higher. So I'm sorry, it's sort of a slightly garbled answer, but I think it's nuanced, but there are ways to encourage farmers to see this as a positive future for their farm. The hardest challenge, of course, is the pub test. Is you need farming communities, when they come together, for the one who's doing this kind of work to stand there with their beer at the bar and feel really proud of what they're doing. And I think things like Groundswell and the Oxford Real Farming Conference and more of these festivals and conferences, which is bringing young farmers together to talk about regen ag and restoration farming and mob grazing, are the future, because they're making farmers proud to be doing this work. And that's I think the most important thing.
So much about nature restoration is nuanced, isn't it? All of it. Right, I'm slightly worried because there's 150 people in this room and there's only 30 copies of your book. So form an orderly queue. I'm just going to finish up by saying thank you all for making the effort to come out on a very fresh autumn evening. And thank you very much to Merlin for making the effort. 2 days of travelling to get here and get back. Thank you for that. And please, yes, all put your hands together for Merlin.